Thank you so much. Thanks, John. And thanks for that introduction and the thoughtful words at the beginning of your remarks. And I do remember our dinner back when my life was a little less busy. And sadly, the set of issues that we were discussing that night, the challenge of Iran's nuclear program, still remains in front of us. I want to say greetings to His Majesty King Hamad, the governor of Bahrain, the IISS Manama Dialogue participants, esteemed ministers, and everybody joining all around the world, both online and in person. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. It is truly an honor to open the 16th Manama Dialogue, my first time speaking to this distinguished audience. This forum's ongoing success speaks enormous volumes about your institute's reach and the powerful role that Bahrain plays in advancing peace and prosperity around the world, and I'll come back to that topic. Look, just this week, our two countries launched an important and comprehensive strategic dialogue. I was happy to chair that. Today, John asked me to talk about a number of things, including the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy more broadly, our achievements with our partners in the Middle East, which I believe are truly historic, and a few lessons learned, perhaps as well. And after that, we'll have a good conversation, a robust Q&A. I want to spend my opening moments by briefly laying out some bedrock principles that have guided the work of our administration. I delivered a speech last year titled "A Foreign Policy from the Founding." And that has a particular meaning in the United States, but it ought to have meaning to all of us today. I explained how this administration has anchored our efforts in the tradition of America, our first principles. It was James Madison who wrote in Federalist 41 that security is an avowed and essential object of our union, of the American Union. Our founders understood that our government's primary duty is to put America's security first. We believe that's true for every sovereign nation. They also favored, our founders, a prudent and restrained foreign policy. They knew that in spite of the fact that our country was powerful, our resources weren't infinite. But even when our nation was young, they also knew the true value of American leadership abroad, what we could accomplish for our people and for the world. And Trump administration has tried to get that balance just right. Look, our signature successes in the Middle East demonstrate what happens when we get it right. 4 years ago, almost exactly, this administration saw that the true cause of conflict in the Middle East wasn't the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but ISIS and the leadership in the Islamic Republic of Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror. We started our approach to the Middle East by leading the fight against ISIS. We had 82 partners, eliminating the caliphate in relatively short order. This was a remarkable multilateral victory. It deserves more attention in my judgment. We did this well, we did this right, and the world remains safer today as a result of that enormously good collective effort. On Iran, we simply saw the regime for what it is, an anti-Western, anti-Semitic government that terrorizes its neighbors and its own people, period, full stop. We learned the lessons from the prior administration's appeasement. Sending pallets of cash didn't change Iran's behavior. Rather, it funded and supercharged their terror campaigns. We understood that a democratic Israel should be a partner, not a problem for countries in the region. And so we flipped the switch. We took a different approach. We rejected appeasement and put security and deterrence, not dialogue for dialogue's sake, at the very front. Very realistic approach. So what did we achieve at this point? We got out of the JCPOA, which traded cash and immunity for Tehran's malign behavior in exchange for unverifiable nuclear pledges that put us all at risk. And with the help of our Gulf allies, our maximum pressure campaign isolated Iran diplomatically, militarily, and economically. We've now leveled 77 rounds of sanctions, targeting close to 1,500 individuals and entities. We've deprived the regime, according to their own words, of some $70 billion for terror. Proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas are now in deep austerity mode. We're standing with the Iraqi Prime Minister, my friend Khatami, in his push against the Iranian-backed militias, and with the people of Lebanon as they reject Hezbollah's corrupt rule. In fact, we've seen multiple countries designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and refuse landing rights to Mahan Air, Iran's terror airline. Look, we also took the regime's chief terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, off the battlefield. It showed what a real red line looks like. And we know, too. We know our campaign is working because now the Iranians are desperately signaling their willingness to return to the negotiating table to get sanctions relief. This effort in the Middle East isn't just about countering Iran, as vital as that is. American strength and resolve have given the leaders in the region the space and, importantly, the confidence to pursue peace and prosperity. The signing of the Abraham Accords at the White House in September wouldn't have been possible without the maximum pressure campaign and our active diplomacy with strong partners in the region. We're not done. We continue to build on that progress. Goods and people are now crisscrossing the region along entirely new routes. It was an honor to be in Israel and greet my friend, Bahraini foreign minister, a few weeks ago. He and I together convened the first trilateral meeting of our governments. And I'm confident that more countries will make the right decisions. They'll do so because it's the right decision for their people. They won't follow the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan's courageous examples in turning the 3 no's of the Khartoum Declaration in 1973 into the 3 yeses of the Abraham Accords. They will do so because it's right for their people. You know, four years ago, John, a lot of influential people in the world would have said that even hoping for these achievements was pure fantasy. But we've shown that the real fantasy was the bankrupt conventional wisdom that said there couldn't be progress until the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians was solved. We could see it was nonsense, and we acted on the fact that we knew that reality would bring peace and prosperity. Our new approach continues to bring the possibility of a better future for all the peoples in the Middle East, including the Palestinians. And indeed, that's the bar against which all future action should be measured. Not the failures of outdated policies. You talked about this. Not the failures of outdated policies based on flawed assumptions, but based on the reality of our times. You know, this is the same fact, the same truth of our policy towards the Chinese Communist Party. And while I won't go into detail here, I hope we have time together to talk. But for decades, the world had hoped that economic integration would lead to political liberalization. The China fantasy. It didn't happen. Chinese Communist Party never wanted to behave like a normal regime because at its core, it's not one. Like Iran, the party is a revolutionary relic. That's why they work together so much. So again, we stepped back. We looked at reality. We remembered first principles and reorganized our policy around a security framework and simple common sense. The good news is we're rallying other nations to our side because this isn't about America versus China. It's about freedom versus tyranny. We all have a stake, including where you sit in the Middle East. This is important to get right. I want to close with one final thought on the Middle East that shows the good that happens when we get this balance perfectly. As you said, I returned home from a trip to Israel and the Gulf just a couple weeks ago now. I was optimistic because of what we've managed to accomplish together. I was encouraged by the level of renewed hope I witnessed, especially among the younger generation. It's as it should be, given the success of the Abraham Accords. But there was another noteworthy agreement, an MOU that we signed with Bahrain in October. We agreed to combat all forms of anti-Semitism, including anti-Zionism, and the delegitimization of the State of Israel. It's the first time our Arab partners formally joined in this effort. It's one way that the Abraham Accords are more than just a peace on paper or between palaces, but among people of the book who share warmth and respect. The descendants of Ishmael are standing with the descendants of Isaac. As an American, I'm proud of that accomplishment. My country was founded on religious freedom and respect for inalienable rights. And those are ideals that we should all uphold. And we know this. When America stands confidently for our founding values, certain that they are exceptional, good, and true, our friends benefit enormously as well. So let's keep at it. Let's not return to the fantasies, the fictions that emboldened our enemies, weakened our friends, and undermined our collective security. Let's keep pressing Iran, standing with our allies, and building on our gains. The last 48 months have proven that a foreign policy grounded on reality and our proudest tradition actually works for the benefit of all of us. Thanks for having me. May God bless you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much indeed. And I hope you can hear a round of applause in the room. We look forward to the conversation just now. One little housekeeping point for the many people we have here gathered in Bahrain in this room and the neighboring room. If you want to seek the floor, and I hope a number will, just press your microphone. Your microphone will turn green. That doesn't mean it's on. It just means that you're on my list, and I'll call on you, and then your microphone will turn red, and then you'll be able to speak and pose your question. And I've got 3 or 4 people already, but let me please perhaps take the cliched privilege of the chair and ask Secretary Pompeo the first question. You spoke a great deal about the challenges posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And last year, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we produced a major 180-page dossier that analyzed all of the various groups with which Iran engages in the Middle East, dozens and dozens of different groups that are part of Iran's influence networks. In our judgment at the time, and the conclusion of the report, is that the Islamic Republic of Iran considers their influence networks in the Middle East as their most important strategic asset, possibly even more important than their nuclear program or their ballistic missile program. And the reason they consider their influence networks as their most important strategic asset is that it is those networks, day in, week out, month by month, that actually change the effective balance of power in the Middle East. And the implicit conclusion of that is that if it is their most prized strategic asset, it won't be a strategic asset that will be easily negotiated away or easily sanctioned away. Might have to be fought. So if you agree with that analysis, what is the strategy to deal with Iran's influence networks in the Middle East?
So I think their security framework, the leadership security framework, actually depends on all 3 of the things you described. Their capacity to continue the capabilities, their nuclear capabilities, their capacity to project those weapon systems and threaten the Middle East with short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, to continue to refine that program. And then you described it, their capacity to have influence operations, including not only militarily, that is their military proxy forces, but their capacity to have influence through other means as well, political means as well. So yes, we have to attack all 3 of those. This was one of the central shortcomings of the JCPOA. It got some verification. It got them to stop turning some centrifuges for a little while, but it underwrote this network of activity that you described, the very influence and proxies that you described. The regime's behavior must change. In May of 2018, I laid out 12 simple points. And I've seen in the international world, I've been ridiculed just a bit for that, and just a touch here at home too. I challenge anyone in the audience today to go back and read those 12 points and tell me which one of those you would find satisfactory if Norway or Sweden engaged in that behavior. All we're asking is for the regime in Iran to behave like a normal nation. And that includes, John, to your point, it includes ceasing this malign activity that takes place through their external influence operations as well. I couldn't tell you if they'll cede that voluntarily. We've seen in life before that things that one thought couldn't be negotiated can when the stakes are right and the costs are sufficient. But in the event that they choose not to do that, in the event that they come to the table and are only willing to talk about turning off a few centrifuges for a few months or a few years, the world should find that unsatisfactory. The Middle East countries, I assure you, will find that unsatisfactory. Whether it's Iraq, whether it's Israel, or whether it's the Gulf states, I would tell you that the good people of Syria who are now living in Turkey or in Lebanon, who were forced to flee because the previous administration's policies appeased the Syrian regime, could tell you that appeasement of Iran will fail the people of their country as well. we have an obligation, a collective obligation, to ensure that we get this right. We ought not cut short a negotiation. We ought not reduce the driver that creates the need for the Iranians to negotiate and be satisfied with the simple idea that we'll get some verification and the capacity for us to stare at some centrifuges and verify every day that they're turned off for just a little while. Look, we've seen what happens. The moment they want to turn them back on, they can do it. It doesn't take very long to spin up a centrifuge. And we see that today. They're at 3.67. They passed a law in the last 48 hours saying they were going to go to 20% enrichment. This tells you that the failure of that agreement was centrally understood by the fact that they can continue to enrich inside of their country. And as long as they have that capacity, they hold the world hostage. We can't permit that to happen. Our administration was clear about this. I hope the entire world will remain clear about the need to truly push back against the broad threat that the regime in Iran poses today, not only from its nuclear program and missile program, but as you spoke about, the other tools that they use to influence and to undermine other nations.
Superb. So we now have, as you can imagine, lots of questions from the floor and also coming in internationally. What I propose, Mr. Secretary, is I take 3 questions here very crisply, and then you can answer those as a group. Could I first ask Giselle Khoury? Your microphone is on.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Pompeo. I want to ask you about your outgoing administration. Why your administration does keep achieving the reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Qatar?
Good. Thank you very much for that. There's a lot of questions actually coming in internationally on to come back to. And now I'd like to call on General Amos Yadlin from Israel, who's with us here in Bahrain, partly as a consequence of the new diplomatic relations. Amos, your microphone is on. Off.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your speech. And even thank you more for the foreign policy you have led that brought finally peace to the Middle East after 25 years that we didn't pay attention to the fact that peace is not here. And this is a different peace, a warm peace. I want to ask about the maximum pressure. How you assess your achievement in the maximum pressure, since unfortunately we see the Iranians closer to the threshold with more enriched uranium and more centrifuges, and just today they announced that we will have another 2 centrifuges in the tunnel under the mountain in Fordo. What can you do in the 50 days that left to your administration, and what is your recommendation for the next administration? Thank you.
Thank you. And also here in Bahrain, John Rain.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your comments. I noted the connection that you made between your foreign and security policy and the founding. There's another founding with which, of course, the US is intimately connected, which is the founding of the post-World War II international order. You gave a very good example of successful collective action in the coalition which the US led against Daesh. I just wanted to ask you, as you look to leaving office, what would you advise constitutes the elements of good collective security and multilateralism, with particular reference to this region?
And the 4th question, before we go back to the Secretary, I'll read out because it's from the editor of The National in the UAE, Mina Al-Oraibi. Mr. Secretary, does the drawdown of troops and diplomats in Baghdad not undercut the Iraqi government and Mr. Khadimi, who needs US support at this time? Won't Iran be emboldened by this US decision? So those are 4 questions for you, Mr. Secretary. Over to you.
I'll try to do them, and at least 2 or 3 of them are actually connected, so great that they were presented in a group. First, look, we are very hopeful that the dispute between the Saudis and the Qataris can be resolved. We hope so because we think that's important for peace throughout the Middle East, but most importantly, we think it's the right thing for the people of each of those countries. We're going to keep working to do what we can to facilitate conversations and dialogue where we can help. We're anxious to be helpful. I get asked all the time, well, when do you think this will end? Or when do you think the next country will sign the Abraham Accords? Goodness gracious, I'm out of the prediction business in terms of timing. It'll be resolved when the parties conclude that it's in their best interest to do so, that it makes sense for their people. This is the central idea, and you talked about going back to founding principles. Every country has its own founding traditions. John, you spoke to this as well. Each country has a history and a tradition and a culture which drives not only its domestic politics, but its place in the world as well, and how they interact with other nations. In this case, these two countries often have different histories, different reflections on the actual history, and the view from the United States is that this conflict is time to be resolved, that the technology used in a nuclear weapons program, or to underwrite the efforts to destabilize the government in Lebanon and prevent it from being reformed in a way that could deliver good outcomes for the Lebanese people. So in that sense, it has worked tremendously. It has now put the Iranian leadership in a very difficult place where they've got to make these hard choices. And they are looking to see if they can't convince the world that, no, the Trump administration had this wrong. You should fund us. You should underwrite us. You should appease us. You should let us have money. You should let European companies come back into our country so that we can build out on all of these terror programs and these malign activities around the world. I think it's fundamentally the wrong direction. You asked my wisdom for the next administration. They're plenty smart enough. They'll figure their way through this. What I would say is, to the world, that can't be the right direction. It cannot be that the right direction is to allow Iran to continue to buy and sell weapons again. It can't be the case that the right direction is to allow Iran to have access to Western technology and Western capital again. Those are the things we have seen that destabilize the Middle East, that make it riskier for people, whether they're in Egypt or Kuwait or in Bahrain. It makes them less able to live their lives in ways that aren't under threat from this theocratic terrorist regime. Down that path lies what we have all seen, a real risk to the stability of the region. The third question was an interesting one about reference to our founding and the founding of the international order and the history of multilateralism. I recall giving a speech in Brussels early on in my time as Secretary of State. I believe I walked off stage without so much as 2 people clapping. It was because I went there that day to talk about our view of how multilateralism can work, and when it ultimately fails the very mission that it is set out to do. And so we talked about how America was going to think about it. There have been multilateral institutions which we have supported, expanded, made better. I would argue NATO is in a much better place today than it was 4 years ago. We had a NATO foreign ministers meeting this past week. I listened to it talk about the threats of the day, from space, from cyber, from China, the threats that continue from Russia. These were conversations that weren't being had, and there are resources available for NATO today that wouldn't have been had without the hard work that America did to convince every nation that it was in its own collective best interest to be part of that important, critical transatlantic multilateral institution. There have been others that we just simply concluded wouldn't work. I'll give you a couple of examples. The World Health Organization. The World Health Organization miserably failed each and every one of the countries that you all represent. It allowed the Chinese Communist Party to obfuscate what took place. It allowed it to cover up. It didn't ring the bell. Its systems failed to prevent a virus from traveling from Wuhan around the world that has now undermined every economy and killed tens of thousands of people. This is tragic. This is a failure of a multilateral institution. There are 3 significant reforms that have taken place over the last dozens of years. They all failed. And so we concluded we were going to find another place, another way that the international community could come together to do pandemic prevention. This has to work. We want to be part of that. The United States wants to be part of that. But the World Health Organization became a political tool instead of a science-based effort to actually deliver security and safety from these pandemics across the world. It's how we think about it. Does it get real results? Does it deliver good outcomes? Is the organization fit for purpose? If it is, we'll reinforce, we'll invest our resources, and we will be a strong partner for every member of the multilateral institution. If it doesn't, we should either fix it or forget it. And that's how we have thought about this. And final question, I'll be brief about this. We're trying to get our force posture right and our diplomatic posture right in Iraq and in Baghdad. We have been committed there for a long time. President Trump made 2 purposes very clear, 2 missions very clear. One is to continue the campaign to make sure that ISIS doesn't raise its ugly head again. And second, to work to make sure that the leadership in Iraq was on the right mission and was focused on its independence and sovereignty and the freedom to be out from under the jackboot of the Iranian regime. I think the things that we have done there to date have made that more likely, more probable. We've welcomed all the efforts that the Gulf states have made to help Prime Minister Khatami be successful. The United States is committed to trying to do that. But Iraq's leadership has a responsibility to my team, to our diplomatic team, and to those of you who have embassies in the Green Zone as well, to do the hard work to make sure that those diplomatic posts are safe and secure. And when they can do that, we're happy to be present and to work. When they can't, we're going to do the right thing for our own security posture, all the while making sure that we are fully committed to the sovereignty and independence of Iraq.
That's superb. With your permission, we'll take 3 or 4, a second round, and I'll ask everybody to be crisp. From Germany, Bastian Giegerick.
Thank you very much, Secretary, for your remarks. You spoke about China and the actions that countries in this region and in other regions should take to put up defenses against that expanding influence, which the Director of National Intelligence U.S. Director of National Intelligence just characterized as being ultimately about dominating the planet economically, militarily, and technologically. A lot of countries, when they take action, take up action to protect themselves, investment screening, supply chain diversification, those kinds of things. What would you advise